So as you well know, as it was covered yesterday, International Relations and Cooperations Minister Naledi Pandor says that South Africa will always advocate for a diplomatic solution in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Now, Pandor hosted her Russian counterpart, Minister Sergei Lavrov, in Pretoria yesterday. Lavrov has, on his part, said that his country has always been open to negotiations with Ukraine, but that the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has prohibited any form of negotiation. Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, which is now almost a year ago. So to help us unpack the significance and other issues around the Russian minister's visit, we joined via Zoom by lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria, Mr. Roland Henwood. Roland, thanks so much for your time and welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning. Thank you.
So let's start with the significance of the visit by the Russian Minister Sergei Lavrov to South Africa. What does it mean for Russia, for South Africa, and of course for our relations as the two countries involved here?
I think it's important for the Russian foreign minister in that this is one of the very few countries that can be seen as a high-level role player in global politics that is willing to accept him on an official visit. South Africa plays a leading role in Africa. South Africa is one of the countries that the European Union, the G7, the US, all hold in high esteem. China the same, Brazil the same. So I think this is quite valuable for the Russian foreign minister. Not sure if it's that valuable for South Africa, though. And I think that's the crux of the issue. There are different interests at play, there are different values at play, and probably all positives from the side of the Russian delegation and the Russian foreign minister. But I'm not convinced that it is all positive in the context of South Africa's engagement and the way in which this engagement is taking place.
So why not, Roland? Please explain to us why this isn't necessarily great for South Africa.
I think the first issue is there's no clarity on South Africa's real position. Yes, we say we are neutral, we keep emphasizing our neutrality, but in essence, if you look at what is happening and the role of Russia in the war in Ukraine, which they refuse to call a war, I think there must be a distinction between a principled position and a position as a neutral and honest broker or attempting to play some role in ensuring peace. In principle, the Russians have broken international law significantly. They are acting in contravention of all the norms of international relations in terms of what is happening in the Ukraine. And South Africa seems to be playing along with that. I'm not saying that is our official position, but that's the impression that is created. And that is a very difficult position for South Africa to be in. In that sense, South Africa is losing and has lost a lot of its standing in the international arena because of its actions of late. And there are many other examples of South Africa not willing to take a principled position. And to me, this is the issue. It is possible to take a principled position in terms of what is totally unacceptable, what is illegal, and still have cordial relationships and still play a role in trying to ensure that there is a peaceful resolution. We are not drawing that distinction. We seem to be saying we are neutral, but in fact we are acting very close to the Russian government, and we seem to be willing to accept whatever comes from that side, and that puts us in an awkward position.
So, Roland, if you'll just expand on that a little more, because when you say that Pretoria is acting in a manner that is not in keeping with its neutral stance, give us examples of that, because, you know, Pretoria would say, well, we haven't necessarily entered into any sort of action that would show opposite. So give us examples from your perspective of where Pretoria has perhaps not acted in a neutral way.
Well, I think the basic issue is that we are not willing to take a position on the principles that underpins what is happening in the Ukraine. We have not condemned the illegal operations, the illegal actions. South Africa has not in the same way embraced or engaged in any way with the Ukrainian government. And remember, this is not something to be seen in isolation. It's the visit of the foreign minister, which is an official visit. But there are so many other visits, engagements, formal engagements between senior South African government members and Russian members of the Russian government that has been happening continuously since the war in the Ukraine started. South Africa has said publicly that it wants to play a role in ensuring a peaceful resolution and in some way become a mediator. There's no action, there's no indication to support that. I mean, the only country that is really pursuing this is Turkey. And we are not seen to be supporting Turkey in this way, in any active or direct way. So I think the actions of the South African government does not back up its words.
So, Roland, Minister Naledi Pandor, to the point that you're making, she has come out and she said, and to quote her, that simplistic and infantile is what she used to describe the demands of the Russian withdrawal from Ukraine, saying that perhaps, we are being overly simplistic and infantile in those demands. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, that's a nice diplomatic way of sidestepping the issue. And here one needs to go back in history. 2014 was when the Russians occupied Ukraine by force. And I mean, that is not acceptable. You are not allowed to enter the territory of another country, occupy it, and then claim it to yourself. And when there's resistance, you blame those who are resisting the opposing government for not being willing to cooperate with you. Russia went further and they occupied 4 important parts of Ukrainian territory since 24th February by military force. And this process started way before that. You can't argue that it's a simplistic approach to say, get out of my territory. I mean, that is the basis of international law and that is the basis of accepted practice in international relations. It is equally simplistic to say that the Russians want to negotiate and Ukraine does not want to negotiate. That's a very simplistic explanation of the position. There is a very strong argument to be made that, yes, of course the Russians want to negotiate, but on their terms, and they reject the terms of the opposing party. So the same claims, I think, can be made from wherever. The issue here is that I agree with the argument that South Africa should not take sides in an overt way, but I think there's a difference between following your own interest, following your own foreign policy values, and not doing much, or being seen as actually, in terms of your actions, taking sides, although you are not acknowledging that.
So if we look at, what you've said there in terms of, as you rightly point out, Russia saying that it is open to negotiations, but Ukraine is not. And I would imagine, the same could be said from the other side. So it's very much that sort of to and fro sort of actions taking place. But going back to the role of South Africa and Pretoria and where it finds itself, when you talk about occupation of one country by another, taking on territory. There are, of course, different schools of thought that say that this situation in Russia and Ukraine is not the first, it's not the only situation of its kind. And why hasn't there been the same sort of pressure brought to bear on Pretoria by commentators to actually come out in a specific way and take a firm stance in other scenarios? What makes this particular conflict and occupation different from others historically?
Okay, I think it's not a question of not pressure being brought to bear on Pretoria. This has been a burning issue in discussions and analysis of South African foreign policy and South African foreign policy orientation. Might not have been in the mainstream media all the time, but it's definitely something that has continuously been there. Getting to the Russia-Ukrainian war, I think the issue here is this is probably the gravest threat to global peace that we've seen for many decades. And the issues at play here is the fact that you have a proper large-scale war in the heart of Europe, in an area that has in the past caused conflicts that became world wars. And with that, the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. And that is bound to escalate the tensions and the fears and the rhetoric and what is going to go with that in terms of engaging with this problem. So it makes it fairly unique.
And I guess for some people, Roland, that makes the point. The way you describe the situation and what is actually happening in Europe, and the fact that this is playing out in Europe, as opposed to Western Sahara, for example, where the Sahrawi people have been fighting for their independence, as opposed to what's happening in the Middle East, for example. Why not the same sort of vigor and attention to those conflicts that have been waging on for way longer than what's happening in Russia?
I think one of the main reasons is that you're looking at some of these conflicts that have been described as intractable. It's not for lack of wanting that the conflicts are continuing. There's been a lot of engagement. But the underlying issue is, it's not the fact that it's Europe. It's the geographical reality of who is involved. In these other conflicts, you did not have the direct involvement and the kind of scale of warfare that we see in Ukraine, and you did not have the underlying threat of use of nuclear weapons being continuously used to put pressure on the process. And that makes a very big difference in terms of who's going to pay attention and in what way is that attention going to be brought to bear on what is playing out.
So it's almost a year on, and that conflict still rages on. So what have we learned in this year of the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
I think we've learned a couple of lessons. The first one is that it is possible for senior leadership in global politics to miscalculate still, to take decisions that are not going to play out the way they expected it to play out. It is possible for a war to happen at this moment in time that involves a huge number of countries, if only in an indirect way. And it is possible to bring the world to the edge of a proper global conflict again. The issue is, how do we resolve this? What we have seen is a woeful inadequacy in the way in which the United Nations Security Council functions. One of the primary movers in this conflict blocks all decision-making in the Security Council because it is a permanent member. So what we see is a demonstration of many of the things we know, but have managed to avert over time. And we're going back to this context where power is going to be, in the short term, probably more important than cool heads and diplomacy. And we are still facing the possibility of a serious eruption of conflict that will affect even more directly everyone in the world.
And I suppose this is why people have been calling for the reform of the United Nations and the Security Council, particularly because of the veto power you talk about. But unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much. And that was Roland Henwood. He is a lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria, helping us unpack Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's visit to South Africa.